"Give me the one no one wanted," he said, and the laughter that followed would haunt that town by sunrise. The line of women stood in the dry heat of Dust Hollow, boots scuffing the hard ground, dresses stiff from travel and dust, 10 of them brought in by wagon from a world far east of this forgotten place. And the men circled slow, like buyers at a livestock pen, hats tipped low, voices low but sharp enough to cut, judging, measuring, deciding what each life was worth in a place where loneliness weighed heavier than gold. And at the very end of that line stood Clara Whitmore, hands folded, chin steady, her dress worn but clean, her eyes not pleading, not hopeful, just watching, as if she had already seen how this would go and accepted it long before she arrived. And one by one the men chose, taking the pretty ones first, the ones who smiled, the ones who knew how to play the part expected of them, leaving space at the end of the line where Clara stood untouched, unspoken to, like something no one wanted to risk carrying home. And the murmurs grew louder, a man near the saloon porch, chuckling into his whiskey. "That one'll be here next week too." And the broker wiped sweat from his neck, glancing at Ethan Cole when his turn finally came, because Ethan didn't step forward like the others, didn't rush, didn't look eager. He just stood there a moment, boots planted in the dust, eyes moving across each face like he was reading something no one else could see. And the wind shifted, carrying the smell of horses and dry wood, and something quieter, something like waiting, and then he moved, slow, deliberate, passing the women already chosen, ignoring the curious looks, ignoring the broker's raised brow, until he stopped in front of the last one. And for a second, no one spoke. Not even the wind seemed to move, because no one expected him to stop there, not at the end, not at her. And Ethan tipped his hat just enough to meet her eyes, steady, equal, not above, not below, just there. And when he spoke, his voice didn't carry far, but it didn't need to. "I'll take her," he said, and the silence broke into laughter, loud, careless, echoing off the wood fronts of the buildings. Like it meant nothing at all, like it was just another joke in a town built on them. But Clara didn't smile, didn't flinch. She just held his gaze for a second longer than expected, and somewhere in that moment, something shifted that no one else noticed. Not yet. And the broker shrugged like he was handing off damaged goods, and the men went back to their drinks, their jokes, their certainty, while Ethan turned away with the one no one wanted, the dust rising behind them as they walked, slow and quiet, toward a ranch that had been empty too long. And behind them, the laughter faded, but not the feeling it left behind, because out here, sometimes the smallest choice wasn't small at all. Sometimes it was the beginning of something the whole town would wish it had seen coming. The ranch sat 2 miles outside Dust Hollow, where the wind never seemed to rest, and the fences leaned like they were tired of standing. And Ethan Cole rode ahead in silence, not once turning back to see if Clara followed. Yet she did, steady in the saddle as if she had done this 100 times before, and that alone felt wrong in a place where most newcomers held the reins too tight or too loose. But she rode like the land did not intimidate her, like it was something she understood rather than feared. And when they reached the house, a small wooden structure weathered by years of sun and dust, Ethan dismounted first, tying his horse with practiced ease before stepping onto the porch that creaked under his boots. And he paused there, just a moment, as if remembering how long it had been since anyone else had crossed that threshold with him. And inside, the air carried the scent of old wood, leather, and quiet, the kind of quiet that builds up when no one speaks for too many nights. And Clara stepped in without hesitation, her eyes moving across the room not with curiosity, but with recognition, as if she was measuring something invisible, something deeper than what the walls showed. And Ethan noticed it, though he said nothing, because words out here were often less useful than silence. And he set a canteen on the table, gesturing slightly. "Water," he said, his voice low, simple, and she nodded once, taking it without thanks, without ceremony, just drinking like someone who knew exactly how much to take and no more. And the sun dropped lower outside, casting long shadows through the window, and still neither of them asked the questions that hung between them, not where she came from, not why no one chose her, not why she did not seem surprised to be here. And instead, Clara moved toward the small desk in the corner, her fingers brushing lightly over its surface before opening the drawer without asking. And Ethan's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in quiet attention, because most people would have asked, would have hesitated, but she did not, and inside the drawer were old papers, land notes, worn edges and faded ink, things Ethan himself had not looked at in months, maybe years, and she lifted one carefully, scanning it in the fading light, her brow tightening just enough to be noticed, and that was when Ethan spoke again, not sharp, not soft, just direct. You read that like it matters, he said, and she looked up at him, holding his gaze in that same steady way she had in town. It does, she replied, and there was something in her voice then, something that did not belong to a woman who had been left at the end of a line, something measured, something certain, and outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the walls like a warning no one else could hear, and Ethan felt it then, not fear, not doubt, but the quiet sense that the choice he made in that dusty street had not been a small one at all, and that whatever story Clara Whitmore carried with her, it had not ended when no one chose her. It had only just begun. The paper felt heavier than it should have in Clara's hands, not because of its weight, but because of the way she held it, like it carried more than ink and numbers, and Ethan watched from across the room, arms resting loose at his sides, saying nothing, because out here a man learned quickly that the truth showed itself better when left alone, and she traced one line with her finger, slow, precise, following the boundary marks as if she could see the land itself beneath the faded ink. This fence line is wrong, she said quietly, and Ethan let out a small breath through his nose, not quite a laugh, not quite agreement. Been that way for years, he replied, and she shook her head once, not dismissive, just certain, not for long. And that was the first time something shifted in the room, something subtle but sharp enough to be felt, like the moment before a storm decides whether it will pass or stay, and outside the window the sky stretched wide and empty, the kind of blue that made everything else feel small, and Ethan stepped closer, just enough to see the paper more clearly. You talk like you know this land, he said, and she folded the paper carefully before setting it back exactly where she found it. I know what is coming for it, she answered, and the words hung there, quiet but heavy, and Ethan studied her then, really studied her, the way her posture never slouched, the way her hands never fidgeted, the way her eyes did not search for approval, and it did not match the story the town had already written about her, and that bothered him more than he expected, not because he cared what the town thought, but because he did not like unanswered questions sitting in his own house, and he turned toward the door, glancing out at the stretch of land that had been his for years, acres of dry grass and stubborn soil that gave just enough to survive, but never enough to grow comfortable. And for a moment he imagined it changing, imagined something cutting through it, something big enough to shift the value of every inch, and he pushed the thought away before it settled too deep. You planning to tell me what you mean? He asked, his voice steady, and behind him Clara stepped closer, not hesitant, not cautious, just measured. Not yet, she said, and there was no defiance in it, only timing, like she understood something he did not, and that was when the sound reached them, faint at first, almost mistaken for wind, but different, rhythmic, distant, and Ethan turned his head slightly, listening the way a man does when something out of place touches the edge of his world, and Clara did not move at all, not even her eyes, as if she had been waiting for that sound long before it arrived, and it grew clearer with each passing second, the steady echo of wheels against hard ground, iron meeting dust, coming from the direction of the main road, slow but deliberate, and Ethan stepped out onto the porch, his boots hitting the wood with quiet certainty, scanning the horizon where a thin line of movement began to take shape, small at first, then sharper, a wagon, no, more than one, and men riding alongside it, their silhouettes straight, structured, not like drifters or traders, but something else, something organized, and behind him Clara's voice came, calm, almost soft. They are early, and Ethan did not turn around, but the weight of her words settled in the same place his instincts had already begun to stir, because whatever was coming down that road was not here by accident, and for the first time since leaving town, he understood one thing clearly. The woman no one wanted had not been waiting to be chosen. She had been waiting to arrive. The wagon did not rush, and that was what made it unsettling, because anything that moved slow across open land like that carried purpose, not hesitation, and Ethan stood at the edge of his porch with one hand resting against the post, watching as the shapes on the horizon grew clearer with each passing second, iron wheels turning steady, horses disciplined, riders straight in their saddles like men who followed rules instead of guessing them. And behind him Clara stepped into the doorway, the shadow of the house falling across her face while the light held her still, and she did not ask what he saw because she already knew. And that quiet certainty pressed against the air harder than the sound of the approaching wagon, and Ethan finally spoke, not turning. "You expecting them?" he said, and she answered just as simply, "Yes," and there was no apology in it, no explanation offered, just a truth placed between them like something that did not need to be defended in the distance. Close to a quarter-mile now, the details sharpening, dark coats despite the heat, polished leather, a wagon reinforced heavier than most supply carts, and a small emblem painted on the side, too far to make out, but clear enough to signal ownership, authority, something bigger than Dust Hollow had ever seen, and Ethan stepped off the porch, boots hitting the dry ground with a dull sound. Walking forward just enough to meet whatever was coming halfway, without surrendering his ground, because this land, whether it was worth much or not, was still his, and he would not greet strangers from behind a door. And the wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint smell of metal and oil, a scent that did not belong to cattle or crops, and Clara moved beside him then, not behind, not ahead, just beside, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady on the road like she had measured this moment, long before it arrived, and for a second Ethan glanced at her, not questioning now, just observing, because whatever she was, whatever she carried into his life, it had already begun to change the ground beneath his feet, and the wagon slowed as it reached the fence line, the horses easing into stillness without command, the riders dismounting in quiet coordination, no wasted movement, no raised voices, just the sound of boots meeting dirt and leather settling, and one man stepped forward. Older, clean-shaven, his coat fitted despite the dust of travel, his eyes scanning the land first before settling on Clara, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of calm that did not need to prove itself. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and the name landed in the open air like a stone dropped into still water, ripples forming in silence. And Ethan felt it then, not surprise, not yet, but confirmation, because the way the man said her name was not casual, not familiar, it was respectful, deliberate, and Clara inclined her head just slightly, acknowledging him without stepping forward, without leaving her place beside Ethan, and that choice, small as it seemed, did not go unnoticed, not by the man, not by Ethan, not by the quiet stretch of land that suddenly felt like it was no longer as empty as it had been yesterday, and the man continued, his gaze shifting briefly to Ethan before returning to her. "We were told you might have arrived sooner," he said, and Clara's voice answered, calm and measured, "Plans changed." And there was something in the way she said it that carried more weight than the words themselves, something final, something chosen, and Ethan stood there, listening, watching, as the pieces he had ignored began to settle into place, not fully, not clearly, but enough to understand one thing. That mattered, the woman no one wanted had not been left behind by chance. She had stepped into this place with intention, and whatever was about to unfold on this land would not be decided by the men who laughed in town, but by the quiet conversation now happening in front of his fence, under a sky that suddenly felt a whole lot closer than it had the day before. The man did not step closer than the fence, and that distance spoke louder than any introduction, because men who understood land knew where to stop, and Ethan noticed it, the way the stranger respected the boundary without asking permission, and that alone told him this was not a simple visit. And the older man reached into his coat slowly, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as someone retrieving something that already carried weight before it was seen, and he produced a folded document, sealed once, but now broken, edges crisp despite the miles it had traveled, and he held it out, not to Ethan, but to Clara, and she took it without hesitation, her fingers steady, her eyes scanning the contents in silence while the wind moved around them like it was trying to listen too, and the riders behind the man remained still, not shifting, not speaking, as if they had already played their part and were now waiting for hers. And Ethan stood there with the quiet patience of a man who had. learned that speaking too soon often cost more than staying silent. But his eyes moved between the paper and her face, catching the smallest changes, the tightening at the corner of her eyes, the almost imperceptible breath she took before folding the document again, slower this time, more deliberate, and when she handed it back, she did not look at the man first. She looked at Ethan, just for a second, and that glance held something new. Not a question, not permission, but recognition, like. She was acknowledging that whatever came next would include him whether he understood it or not. And then she turned back to the man. "It is confirmed then," she said, her voice carrying the same calm as before. But now there was something beneath it, something settled, and the man nodded once. "The route will pass through here," he replied, gesturing slightly toward the stretch of land behind Ethan's house, the dry acres that had never been worth more than survival. And the words seemed simple, but they shifted the ground beneath everything, because a route meant movement, and movement meant value, and value meant change, and Ethan felt it settle into place, slow but undeniable, like a door opening that he had not known was there. And the man continued. "We will begin surveying within the week. Agreements will need to be signed, boundaries reassessed," and his eyes flicked again toward Ethan, this time not ignoring him, not dismissing him, but measuring him, as if deciding where he fit in something larger than this moment. And Clara spoke before Ethan could respond, her tone even. "Nothing will be signed today," she said, and the man paused, not surprised, just acknowledging. "Of course," he answered, stepping back half a pace. And that small movement shifted the entire exchange, because it made clear who held the decision, and it was not the men who arrived with documents, and it was not the town that laughed the day before, and it was not even the land itself, but the woman who had been left standing at the end of a line. And Ethan looked out across his property then, the same land he had walked for years, the same fences he had mended by hand, and for the first time he saw it differently, not as something worn down, but as something waiting. And when he turned back, Clara was already stepping away from the fence, walking toward the house. Without hurry, without looking back to see if the men would follow, because she already knew they would not without her word. And Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, the weight of what he had just heard settling into something steady, something real. And then he followed her, boots pressing into the dust, knowing one thing with quiet certainty. The choice he made in that town had not brought trouble to his door. It had brought something far more dangerous than that. It had brought change, and out here, change was never something a man could ignore. The house felt smaller when they stepped back inside, not because the walls had moved, but because something larger had entered with them, something that did not need space to be felt. And Clara moved to the table with the same quiet control she had shown since the moment Ethan chose her, placing her hands lightly on the wood, as if grounding herself in a place that was not truly hers yet. And Ethan closed the door behind them, the soft thud echoing in the room like a line being drawn. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them not awkward but deliberate, like both understood that whatever came next mattered too much to rush. And Ethan finally stepped forward, stopping just across from her, his eyes steady, his voice low but firm. "You knew this was coming," he said, not as an accusation, not as a question, but as a truth that needed to be acknowledged. And Clara met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she answered. And there it was, simple and complete. No attempt to soften it, no attempt to hide behind anything else. And Ethan let out a slow breath, nodding once as if confirming something to himself rather than reacting to her. "Then you knew what this land would become," he continued, and she shifted slightly, not away from him but into the conversation. "I knew what it could become," she said, and that distinction settled into the room with quiet weight, because possibility and certainty were not the same thing, and Ethan understood that, even if he did not yet understand her. And he walked to the window, looking out across the stretch of dry earth that had been his world for years, the fences, the worn paths, the stubborn patches of grass that survived more out of will than comfort. And he spoke again, almost to himself. "Men in town laughed when I picked you," he said, and behind him Clara did not respond right away, giving the words space to settle. And when she did, her voice was softer than before, not weaker, just more personal. "They laughed because they thought I was less," she said, and Ethan turned back then, studying her with a new kind of focus. "And are you?" he asked, not mocking, not challenging, just asking. And Clara held his gaze, steady as the horizon outside. "No," she replied, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation could have, and the wind pressed lightly against the walls again, a steady reminder that the world outside had already begun to shift, and Ethan leaned one hand on the table, the wood creaking slightly under the pressure. "Then tell me what you are," he said, and this time Clara did not answer immediately, her eyes dropping just briefly, not in doubt, but in consideration, as if choosing how much truth to give and when. And when she looked back up, there was something different there, not guarded, not distant, but open in a way that had not been there before. "I am the reason those men stopped at your fence instead of riding past it," she said, and Ethan felt that settle deeper than anything else she had said so far, because it was not just a statement, it was a shift in how he understood everything that had happened since yesterday. And he straightened slightly, the pieces aligning not fully but enough, and outside, the faint sound of the wagon still lingered in the distance, not leaving, not pressing forward, just waiting. And Ethan realized then that whatever decision came next would not be forced, it would be chosen. And that choice would define more than just his land. It would define who he stood beside when the rest of the world finally understood what he had already begun to see, that the woman no one wanted had never been waiting to be chosen. She had been deciding where she would stand all along. The light outside had begun to soften, stretching shadows across the land like quiet fingers reaching farther than before, and Ethan stood still for a moment longer, letting Clara's words settle into him the way dust settles after a long ride, slow and certain, and then he moved, not away from her, but toward the door again, because some things were not meant to be understood inside four walls. And when he stepped back onto the porch, the air felt different, not cooler, not warmer, just heavier, with meaning, and the wagon remained where it had stopped, the men still waiting without impatience, without urgency, as if time itself worked differently for them. And Ethan rested his hands on the railing, eyes scanning the horizon before dropping to the fence line, tracing the path in his mind, imagining iron tracks cutting through the dry earth, stretching mile after mile, connecting places that had never needed each other before. And behind him Clara stepped out again, her presence no longer unfamiliar, no longer out of place, just there, steady as the land itself. And she did not speak right away, letting him take in what he needed to see. And after a moment he said quietly, "That route changes everything." And she nodded once, not looking at him, but at the same stretch of land. "Yes," she said, and there was no pride in it, no claim, just acknowledgement. And Ethan let out a breath that carried more than air, something closer to acceptance, and he turned, slightly, enough to face her without fully leaving the view behind. "Then you could have chosen any place," he said, and this time she looked at him, her expression calm but not distant. "I did," she replied, and the answer did not need more than that, because it carried its own weight, and Ethan held her gaze for a second longer than before, measuring something not in words but in presence, in the way she stood, in the way she had never once asked for permission to exist in his world, and that told him more than any explanation could have. And down by the fence, the older man shifted slightly, not impatient, just aware that decisions were forming beyond his reach, and the riders remained mounted or standing beside their horses, their discipline unchanged, their attention steady, and the sun dipped lower, casting a golden hue across everything, turning the dust into something almost soft. And Ethan finally stepped down from the porch again, moving forward a few paces before stopping, not crossing the fence, not closing the distance, just placing himself where he could be seen clearly. And the older man met his gaze this time, not just glancing, but recognizing him as part of the moment. And Ethan spoke, his voice carrying across the short distance without force. "You said agreements will need to be signed," he said, and the man inclined his head slightly. "Yes," he answered, and Ethan nodded once, as if confirming something to himself rather than seeking approval. "Then, they will wait," he said, and there was no challenge in it, no resistance, just a statement placed firmly in the ground. And the man studied him for a brief moment before nodding again. "Of course," he replied, stepping back half a pace once more, and that small movement sealed something unspoken. Recognition not of authority, but of alignment, and Ethan turned back then, walking toward Clara without hurry, without hesitation, and when he reached her, he did not speak, did not ask, he simply stood beside her, matching her position, her stillness, her quiet certainty, and out there, beyond the fence, the men waited, the land waited, the future waited, but on that porch, in that fading light, one thing had already been decided, not with words, not with signatures, but with something far quieter, a man choosing where he stood and not moving from it. The sun dipped lower, stretching gold across the land in a way that made everything look softer than it truly was. And Ethan remained where he stood beside Clara, not speaking, not moving, just letting the weight of what had begun settle into something steady inside him. And beyond the fence the men still waited, their patience no longer surprising, because this was no longer a visit that needed urgency. It was a moment that needed agreement, and Clara's gaze drifted slowly across the horizon, following the invisible path that would one day be carved into steel and motion. And for the first time, she spoke without being asked, her voice quieter than before but deeper. When the tracks come through, this land will not belong to the silence anymore, she said, and Ethan listened, his eyes still on the distance. It never did, he replied, and there was no bitterness in it. Only truth shaped by years of living where nothing came easy and nothing stayed still for long. And Clara turned slightly toward him, studying him in a way she had not allowed herself to before, not measuring, not judging, just seeing. And she understood something then, something that had not been written in any letter or document, that Ethan Cole was not a man who needed to be convinced of change, only a man who needed to decide if he would stand with it or against it. And she spoke again, more directly now. They will offer you more money than this land has ever been worth, she said, and Ethan nodded. Once, not surprised. They always do when they want something bad enough, he answered, and the wind brushed past them again, lifting dust in slow spirals that faded as quickly as they formed, and Clara's eyes followed one of them, before returning to him. And if you refuse, she continued, and Ethan finally looked at her fully, meeting her gaze with the same steady presence he had carried since the beginning. Then they will wait, he said, and there was something in that answer that made Clara pause, not because it was unexpected, but because it was complete, and she realized then that he was not speaking about the men beyond the fence. He was speaking about himself, about time, about the way he chose to move through a world that rarely gave him reasons to trust it. And down below, the older man shifted his stance again, exchanging a quiet glance with one of the riders, not concerned, not impatient, just aware that the outcome would not be decided by pressure, and the sky above deepened into shades of amber and blue, the kind that marked the end of one day and the beginning of something else. And Clara stepped forward then, just one step, enough to place herself fully at the edge of the porch, looking out, across the land that had brought her here, and she spoke, not to the men, not to the wind, but to the space between herself and Ethan. I did not come here to take anything from you, she said, and her voice carried a quiet certainty that did not ask to be believed, and Ethan did not answer right away, letting the words settle, letting them find their place beside everything else that had already been said without being spoken. And when he did speak, it was just as quiet, just as certain. Then, stay, he said, and there was no condition in it, no question, just an offer shaped by choice rather than need. And Clara held his gaze for a moment longer than before, and something in that moment shifted again, something that could not be seen from beyond the fence, something that did not need witnesses, because out here, the most important decisions were never the loud ones, they were the ones made in silence, under a sky that did not care who owned the land beneath it, only who was willing to stand on it and not walk away. The last light of day settled into the land like a quiet promise, and for a moment everything seemed to hold its breath, the wagon, the men, the wind itself, as if waiting to see what would happen next. And Ethan did not move from where he stood beside Clara, not because he did not have questions, but because he understood that answers, the real ones, did not come from pushing. They came from watching what a person chose when they did not have to choose at all. And Clara remained at the edge of the porch, her eyes still on the horizon, but her attention no longer distant. It had shifted inward, towards something more immediate, something closer, and after a long silence she spoke again, softer now, not to explain, but to reveal just enough. My father used to say land tells the truth about people, she said, and Ethan glanced at her, not interrupting, not reacting, just listening, and she continued, not what they say, not what they promise, only what they choose to do when it matters, and her voice carried a weight that did not come from memory alone, but from experience, from something lived and carried forward, and Ethan nodded slightly, because that was something he understood without needing to agree out loud. And he looked back across his property, the worn fence lines, the uneven ground, the stubborn pieces of earth that had refused to give more than they had to. And he realized that every inch of it had already spoken for him, long before Clara ever arrived. And down by the fence, the older man took a single step forward, not crossing the boundary, but closing the distance just enough to be heard without. Raising his voice, "Miss Whitmore," he called, his tone still respectful, still measured, and Clara turned her head just slightly, acknowledging him without stepping away from where she stood, and the man continued. "We can return tomorrow if you prefer," he said, and there was no pressure in the offer, only patience, the kind that came from knowing the outcome was not uncertain, only delayed, and Clara held his gaze for a moment, then shook her head once, slow, deliberate. "No," she said, and that single word carried further than any explanation could have, because it was not refusal, it was timing, and Ethan felt it, the shift from waiting to decision, not loud, not dramatic, just clear, and Clara stepped down from the porch then, her boots meeting the dry ground with quiet certainty. And Ethan watched her for half a second before following, not out of obligation, not out of curiosity, but because standing still no longer matched the direction things were moving. And together they walked toward the fence, side by side, their pace unhurried but aligned, and when they stopped a few feet from the older man, Clara spoke, her voice steady. "The land stays as it is," she said, and the man listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, and she continued, "No agreements. Until the boundaries are reviewed properly." And Ethan felt that word settle, properly, because it meant something more than measurement, it meant fairness, it meant intention, and the man nodded once, not surprised, not resistant. "Understood," he replied, and there was a brief pause, the kind that holds more meaning than movement, and then Clara added, her voice just as calm, "And the ranch remains his." And this time the man's eyes shifted to Ethan fully, not measuring now, but recognizing. And Ethan met that look without speaking, without changing his stance, and the silence between them carried something new, something equal, and the wind moved through again, softer now, like it had found its place in what was unfolding, and behind them, the house stood quiet, unchanged, but everything around it had begun to shift, not in noise, not in force, but in something far more lasting. The quiet understanding that value was not decided by those who laughed first, but by those who stayed long enough to see what others missed. The agreement settled into the air without ink, without signatures, just a few quiet words that carried more weight than any document the man had brought with him, and Ethan stood there beside Clara, feeling something unfamiliar take shape, not pressure, not resistance, but alignment, the kind that did not come often and did not ask twice. And the older man gave a slight nod before stepping back again, signaling to the others without speaking, and one by one the riders moved with quiet precision, adjusting reins, turning their horses, preparing to leave without argument, without question, because whatever authority they carried had already recognized something greater standing in front of them. And as the wagon began to roll slowly away from the fence, its wheels pressing into the dry earth with steady purpose, Ethan watched it go, not with relief, not with concern, but with a deeper awareness that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something that would return, again and again, until the land itself changed shape, and beside him Clara remained still, her gaze following the wagon only briefly before shifting back to the ranch, to the house, to the ground beneath her boots, and for the first time since she arrived, she exhaled in a way that was almost visible, not tension leaving, but certainty settling, and Ethan noticed it, the smallest release in her posture, and it told him more than anything she had said so far, because it meant this moment had mattered to her as much as it had begun to matter to him. And the dust from the wagon trailed off into the distance, fading into the horizon until the land returned to its familiar quiet. But the silence no longer felt the same. It felt fuller, like something had been added rather than taken away. And Ethan turned slightly toward Clara, studying her again with that steady, measured look that had never once carried doubt, only observation. "You could have signed," he said, his voice calm, not questioning, just stating what had been left undone, and Clara nodded once, not defensive, not uncertain. "Yes," she replied, and for a moment neither added anything more, because the answer did not need explanation, and the wind moved through the fence posts with a low sound, almost like a whisper carried across the open space, and Ethan stepped closer to the gate, resting one hand against the worn wood, his fingers tracing the grain absent-mindedly as if grounding himself in something familiar while everything else shifted around him. And after a moment he spoke again, quieter this time. "Why didn't you?" he asked, and Clara turned to face him fully now, not distant, not guarded, just present, and her answer came without hesitation. "Because it was not just mine to sign," she said, and the words landed between them with a clarity that did not need to be explained. And Ethan held her gaze, understanding unfolding not in pieces, but all at once, because what she had said was not about ownership, it was about choice, about standing beside someone rather than stepping ahead of them. And he nodded slowly, not out of agreement, but out of recognition, in the sky above. Them deepened into evening, the last light slipping away behind the distant hills, leaving the ranch in that quiet space between day and night where everything felt more honest, more real, and Clara stepped back toward the house, her movement unhurried, natural, as if she had always belonged to this place even before she arrived, and Ethan followed a few steps behind, not because he had to, but because it felt right, and as they reached the porch again, he paused for just a moment, looking back, once more at the land that had begun to change without a single line being drawn, and he realized then that the men in town had been wrong in a way they would not understand for a long time, because they had not just overlooked a woman, they had overlooked a decision, a moment, a shift that would reach further than any of them could see. And inside the house the quiet waited again, but it was no longer empty. It carried something new, something steady, something that did not need to announce itself to be real. And as Ethan stepped through the doorway, he understood one thing with quiet certainty. The future had already arrived at his fence, and it had chosen to stay. The night settled in slow and steady, wrapping the ranch in a kind of quiet that felt earned rather than empty. And inside the house the lantern cast a warm glow across the wooden walls, softening the edges of everything that had once felt worn and forgotten, and Ethan moved with familiar ease, setting the lantern on the table, pouring water into 2 tin cups without asking if she wanted one, because some gestures did not need words. And Clara accepted it with a small nod, her hand steady, her presence no longer that of a stranger passing through, but something closer to belonging, though neither of them had said it out loud, and for a while they sat across from each other in silence, the kind that did not press or demand, just existed, allowing thoughts to settle into place. And outside the wind moved across the land, brushing against the fence posts, carrying the faint scent of dust and distance, and Ethan finally spoke, his voice low, measured. "Tomorrow, they will come back," he said, not as a guess, but as something already understood, and Clara nodded once, her gaze steady. "Yes," she replied, and there was no concern in it, no hesitation, just acceptance of what would follow. And Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her again, not searching for answers now, but observing what was already there. "And the town will hear about it," he added, and this time Clara's expression shifted just enough to be noticed, not into worry, but into awareness. "They will," she said, and the weight of that truth settled between them, because Dust Hollow was not a place where things stayed quiet for long, especially not something like this. And Ethan let out a slow breath, glancing toward the door, as if he could already see the ripple effect moving through the streets. The same men who laughed, the same voices that dismissed her, now turning their attention toward something they did not yet understand. And he spoke again, quieter now. "They will come here." And Clara held his gaze, not asking who, not asking why, because she already No. Yes, she said again. And this time the word carried something more, not just acknowledgement, but readiness, and Ethan nodded once, his decision settling into place the same way it had earlier, without force, without hesitation, and he stood, moving toward the door, opening it just enough to look out into the dark, the land stretching wide under a sky filled with stars that had seen more stories than any man could remember. And he stood there for a moment, listening, not for danger, not for trouble, but for something deeper, something that told him whether he was standing where he was meant to be. And behind him Clara remained at the table, watching him, not interrupting, not following, just giving him the space to arrive at his own understanding. And after a moment he closed the door again, turning back toward her, his posture unchanged, but something in his eyes clearer than before. When they come, he said, they will not be asking you. And Clara's gaze did not waver. No, she replied, and there was no fear in it, no doubt, just truth. And Ethan stepped closer, stopping at the edge of the table, his voice steady, firm in a way that did not need to be raised. Then they will be speaking to me, he said, and for the first time since she arrived, Clara's expression softened, not into relief, not into gratitude, but into something quieter, something like recognition, and she nodded once, not because she needed him to say it, but because she understood what it meant that he had. And outside, the wind continued its slow movement across the land, carrying the night forward, and inside that small house, under the soft glow of lantern light, a line had been drawn without being marked, a choice had been made without being declared. And when morning came, it would not be the same dust hollow that laughed the day before, because now, whether they understood it or not, they would be walking into something they could not control, something that had already taken shape in silence, between two people who did not need to say more to stand exactly where they were meant to be. Morning did not arrive with noise. It came quietly, like it understood something had already been decided before the sun even touched the horizon, and the first lights stretched across the land in pale gold, revealing the same fences, the same worn paths, but nothing felt the same anymore, and Ethan was already awake, standing on the porch with a tin cup in his hand, watching the distance the way a man does when he knows something is coming and chooses not to hide from it. And behind him the door opened softly, Clara stepping out into the early light, her presence steady, unchanged, as if the night had not shaken anything inside her, only settled it further, and she stood beside him without speaking, her eyes following the same line his had traced since before sunrise. And for a while there was only the sound of wind moving across open ground, and then it came, faint at first, the distant rhythm of hooves, not one, not two, but many, and Ethan did not turn, did not react, he only shifted his weight slightly, grounding himself in the place he had chosen to stand, and Clara's gaze remained fixed forward, her expression calm, not surprised, not concerned, just aware, and as the sound grew closer, shapes formed along the horizon, riders, several of them, moving with less discipline than the men from the day before, but with more urgency, more noise, and that alone told the story before they even arrived. And Ethan let out a slow breath, not in frustration, not in readiness, but in acceptance, because this was the part that always followed change, not the quiet agreements, not the measured conversations, but the questions that came from those who had been left outside of it. And the riders approached the fence without slowing much, dust trailing behind them, voices carrying before their horses even stopped, and Ethan stepped forward just enough to meet them where the boundary began, not crossing it, not inviting them in, just standing where the line held meaning. And Clara remained where she was on the porch, not stepping forward, not retreating, simply watching, because this part was not hers to lead. And the first man pulled his horse to a stop, his expression tight with something between curiosity and disbelief. Heard you turned down a deal, he said, not greeting, not asking, just stating what had already spread through the town overnight. And Ethan looked at him without reaction, his voice even. You heard right, he answered, and the men exchanged glances, shifting in their saddles, not aggressive, not calm, just uncertain, because the story they had heard did not match what they expected to see. And one of them glanced past Ethan toward the house, toward Clara standing still in the morning light, and there was something in that look, something that tried to place her back into the role they understood, the one no one chose, the one that did not matter, and Ethan saw it, not with anger, not with challenge, but with clarity, and he stepped half a pace to the side, just enough to block that line of sight without making a show of it. And when he spoke again, his voice did not rise, but it carried further. "If you have business, you speak it here," he said, and the words settled across the space like a boundary drawn in air, and for a moment no one answered, the wind moving between them, the horses shifting slightly. And then the first man nodded once, slower now, the certainty in his posture easing into something else, something closer to respect, and behind Ethan, the porch remained quiet, Clara still standing where she had chosen to stand, not hidden, not presented, just there, and the morning light grew stronger, casting everything in clearer lines, and for the first time since the riders arrived, the town's understanding began to shift, not in words, not in agreement, but in something quieter, something that could not be undone. The realization that what they had dismissed the day before was now standing behind a man who had already decided where he would stand, and was not moving. The silence that followed did not break. It settled, deeper than before, like the land itself had accepted something it had been waiting on for years, and Ethan stood where he was, one hand resting lightly against the fence post, his posture unchanged, his eyes steady on the men in front of him, not challenging, not yielding, just present in a way that left no room for confusion, and one by one the riders shifted, not out of fear, not out of defeat, but out of understanding, because whatever they had come to question no longer needed questioning. And the first man gave a small nod, not to Clara, not even fully to Ethan, but to the moment itself, and he turned his horse without another word, the others following soon after, their movements quieter now, more measured, as if something in them had adjusted without needing to be spoken aloud, and the dust they carried with them rose briefly before fading back into the earth, leaving the ranch as it had been, but not as it was, and Ethan remained still for a few seconds longer, watching the horizon until the last shape disappeared, and only then did he step back from the fence, turning slowly toward the house where Clara still stood, her figure framed by the morning light, unchanged, unmoved. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because everything that needed to be said had already found its place between them, and Ethan walked back across the dry ground, each step steady, unhurried, until he reached the porch, stopping just short of the first step, and he looked out once more at the land, the same land that had been overlooked, underestimated, dismissed by those who never stayed long enough to understand it, and now it stood the same, but carried something more, something that could not be seen, only recognized, and Clara stepped forward then, closing the small distance between them, not to stand ahead, not to follow, but to stand beside, exactly where she had chosen to be from the beginning, and Ethan glanced at her, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging, and there was a quiet in that look that held more than words ever could, and the wind moved across the open space again, softer now, almost like it had settled into the new shape of things, and somewhere in the distance, far beyond the ridge, the faint echo of iron against earth would one day follow. But not today, not yet, and that was enough. And Ethan finally stepped up onto the porch, the wood creaking under his boots in a familiar way that no longer felt lonely, and he rested his hand briefly against the door before opening it, not as a man returning to the same place, but as a man stepping into something that had changed without asking permission, and Clara followed, her steps quiet, certain, and as the door closed behind them, the ranch stood still under the wide sky, unchanged to any passing eye, but carrying a truth that would take time for the world to catch up to. That value was never decided in a line of choices, never measured by who was picked first or last, but revealed in the quiet moments when someone chose to see what others refused to look at. And out here, where the wind remembered everything and the land never forgot, that kind of choice did not fade. It stayed, long after the laughter was gone.